The Bridger-Teton wilderness in Wyoming is the kind of place that swallows sound. On cold evenings, when the wind curls low through the pines and the snow hardens into a thin crust, even the birds go silent. Rangers who know this land well describe it as both home and hazard. A space that offers breathtaking wildlife and endless solitude but demands respect every step of the way. Ranger Ethan Miller understood that balance better than most. He had worked these trails for years, checking cameras, clearing blockages, keeping visitors safe. But one November evening, that familiarity would prove deceptive. Routine became risk. Risk became silent. Ethan left his cabin in the late afternoon, boots crunching over frost, a pack slung across his shoulder. He carried a thermos, a first aid kit, and his radio. He planned for just a short patrol, an easy loop to confirm that the remote trail cameras on Ridge 9 were still working before the winter storms arrived. Rangers know these quick runs are necessary. If the cameras fail under ice, weeks of wildlife monitoring data are lost. And in an ecosystem where grizzly bears, black bears, and even endangered species like the wolverine depend on seasonal studies, those missing weeks can mean bad decisions later. The drive was short. His truck rattled over a narrow gravel road, headlights pushing through the encroaching twilight. By the time he parked at the trailhead, the sun had already dropped behind the peaks. Snow glittered faintly on the ridges. Ethan tugged his jacket closer, pulled his hat low, and began to climb. Every ranger knows the first rule sign: out sign in. Ethan had logged his patrol time at the ranger station. Protocol requires supervisors to expect contact within a window. If the radio goes silent, beyond that someone gets called. Dispatchers know exactly who to notify, and within hours, search and rescue plans begin. This process saves lives. But in those first hours, a ranger is still alone with the wild. Ethan followed the path steadily, boots pressing into frozen soil, the forest opening and closing around him. He'd done this trek hundreds of times, often without a second thought. Yet that night the air felt charged, as if the whole landscape was waiting for something. The trail bent along a ridge where a thin crust of ice stretched across shadowed ground. His boot landed, and in one unforgiving second, grip failed. He slid sideways, gravity taking control. His shoulder slammed against a rock. Branches snapped under his weight. He tumbled through brush, shouting once before the cold air swallowed his voice. When he finally stopped, he lay twisted in a hollow pine needles, scattered across his jacket radio, tossed from his hand. Pain arrived in waves, sharp in his shoulder, dull in his head. He tried to push himself up, but his arm wouldn't cooperate. A groan escaped muffled into the earth. His training told him to reach for the radio call and stabilize. But his body answered with darkness. His eyes closed, and the wilderness carried on above him as if nothing had changed. Hours passed. The temperature dropped steadily. In November, Wyoming nights are unforgiving. Hypothermia does not wait politely. It creeps in subtle, at first shivering confusion, then relentless. Rangers know that if someone goes down after dusk, the odds of survival drop with each degree. Yet somehow Ethan remained breathing shallow, unconscious, exposed. Here lies the mystery. Why was he not lost to predators that patrol these forests? Grizzly bears, the giants of the Rockies, do not hibernate on a strict schedule. In early winter, some are still active, searching for food before dens close. A man injured and bleeding should have been a target, a curiosity at best. But something else happened. To understand that, we pause on science. Bears are not machines of aggression. Their responses vary with season, hunger, weather, and individual temperament. In colder months, energy conservation often overrides aggression. A bear that might charge in summer may simply observe in November. If a scent is strange, human mixed with blood, pine sap, and cold air, it may confuse rather than trigger predation. And for female bears, especially mothers with yearlings, a different instinct sometimes flickers protection. Not for the human, but for the vulnerable shape before them that resembles fragility. Biology doesn't always fit tidy boxes, but scientists have documented unusual, non-aggressive bear behavior before. Cases in Canada describe black bears lingering near injured hikers without striking. In Alaska, there are stories rare but real of polar bears circling fishermen until rescue arrived. These are exceptions, not rules, but exceptions matter. Ethan, of course, knew none of this. He lay unmoving, his mind wandering through fragments of dreams. Cold pressed into his skin. Breath fogged faintly above him. He felt dimly the presence of something large, a vibration in the ground, but in his state it might as well have been memory. Meanwhile, back at the station, protocol ticked forward. Ethan had not checked in. His supervisor logged the silence, contacted dispatch, and by midnight a team was preparing to search. Experienced officers know how dangerous it is to delay. In mountainous terrain, hours can mean the difference between a rescue and recovery. The first sweep would begin at dawn. They did not expect company in the form of wild animals. They expected a frozen trail, maybe tracks, maybe nothing. And here is where the lesson lies. Familiarity breeds risk. Ethan had patrolled those ridges so many times he trusted them more than he should have. The wilderness demands respect always. One misstep, a slick patch of ice, a distracted glance can collapse everything. For rangers as for hikers and campers, the truth is constant. The land doesn't play favorites. Whether you are a seasoned officer or a tourist with brand new boots, gravity answers to no one. Yet the wilderness also surprises. Just as it can wound, it sometimes shelters. This duality is why people keep returning despite danger. To feel small and yet cared for, threatened yet humbled. Ethan's accident was a reminder of both sides. He was broken, vulnerable, yet not alone. As the night deepened, shadows shifted. The forest, silent at first, stirred with quiet steps. Shapes moved between the trees, massive, deliberate, breathing fog into the freezing air. By the time the rescue team arrived in the gray light of dawn, they would find Ethan not abandoned, but encircled. And the circle would raise more questions than answers. What the rescuers saw that morning defied every rule in their manuals. Instead of a lifeless ranger, they found a ring of wild grizzly bears standing guard. And what those bears did or didn't do would set the stage for one of the most extraordinary wildlife stories ever recorded. The rescue team expected silence. They had set out before dawn, headlights bouncing along the frozen road until the trucks could go no further. From there, they hiked in pairs, radios clipped to their jackets, snow crunching under boots. They knew the rules spread out. Check ravines, call Ethan's name every few minutes. Rangers missing overnight usually turn up cold, sometimes injured, sometimes worse. No one expected what they would see when they reached the hollow below Ridge 9. Ethan was there, sprawled on his back jacket, torn, his radio just out of reach. But it wasn't the sight of their colleague that froze the rescuers in place. It was the circle around him. 5 grizzly bears, massive, silent, steady, stood in a half-ring, their breath visible in the morning air. At first, no one moved. Search leaders are trained to handle dangerous wildlife. But nothing in their manuals covered this. The normal rule is clear: if a grizzly bear is nearby, create distance. If it's a sow with cubs, retreat immediately. And if there are multiple bears, call it off. But these bears weren't charging. They weren't even feeding. They were waiting. One older female, her muzzle silvered with age, stood closest. 2 yearlings lingered near her paws, shifting on the frozen ground. Another younger bear paced behind, sniffing the air, while a 5th stayed further back in the shadows. Their formation wasn't random. They held space around Ethan, not tight, not loose, but deliberate, like guards posted at an unseen boundary. The rescuers whispered among themselves, unsure. "Do we scare them off?" one asked. The leader shook his head. Any sudden noise could trigger aggression. They waited, hearts pounding, until finally the older female shifted. She lowered her head, exhaled a deep rumble, not a growl, not a warning, but something that sounded closer to acknowledgement. Then she settled down, lying near Ethan's side as though she belonged there. Science tells us this shouldn't happen. Grizzly bears are apex predators, opportunistic feeders. An unconscious human could easily be investigated as prey. Yet here no claws struck, no jaws closed. Theories offer some explanation. In late fall, with cold pressing in, grizzlies conserve energy. Aggressive displays are costly, and without an immediate food trigger, caution sometimes outweighs attack. Others argue that maternal instinct may have influenced the older female. Vulnerability, whether in a cub or another creature, can draw a protective posture rather than predation. There's also the matter of scent. Blood mingled with pine resin snow. And sweat might have confused signals, making Ethan seem less like a threat and more like an injured animal of the forest. Still, explanations fall short. The bears didn't just tolerate his presence, they guarded it. And that distinction matters. Examples from the past show how rare this is. In the Yukon, a black bear once stayed near an injured logger until rescuers arrived, never touching him but never leaving. In Alaska, a polar bear was documented circling a collapsed hunter until others came pawing the ground, but not the body. These are scattered cases debated among scientists. Some say coincidence, others whisper about empathy across species. But even skeptics admit behaviors outside the norm carry weight. For the rescuers on Ridge 9, weight came in the form of silence. Every breath felt too loud. Every step is too risky. They had to reach Ethan, but the path was blocked by living monuments of the wild. Finally, one ranger whispered, "They're not attacking, they're protecting him." The words hung heavy in the cold. No one contradicted them. Minutes stretched. Slowly, as the morning light strengthened, the bears began to move. The younger ones shifted first, edging toward the trees with reluctant steps. The older female lingered, her head-lifted eyes fixed on Ethan as if making a final decision. Then, with a low exhale, she turned and walked back into the forest, her form fading into shadow. One by one, the others followed, until the hollow was empty of everything except frost and a wounded ranger. The rescuers rushed forward, then dropped to their knees beside Ethan. His pulse was faint but present. His skin was pale, his lips tinged with blue. They wrapped him in emergency blankets, secured his arm, and lifted him onto a stretcher. But even as they worked, each of them kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting the circle to reform. It never did. Here lies the lesson: nature doesn't always follow our scripts. We expect wild animals to be hostile, dangerous, and unpredictable, and often they are. That's why rangers warn hikers to carry bear spray, why trailheads post signs about keeping distance. But moments like this remind us that wildlife is not defined only by threat. Sometimes instinct bends towards something else. Curiosity, restraint, even what looks like compassion. We must be cautious not to romanticize. Bears are not gentle guardians. Yet refusing to acknowledge the mystery in their behavior is just as misleading. A fresh perspective emerges here. Conservation often frames bears as either villains or victims, either dangerous predators to be managed or endangered icons to be saved. But what if they are both and more? What if they are complex neighbors capable of responses that resist simple categories? Recognizing that complexity doesn't make the wilderness safer, but it makes our relationship with it more honest. As Ethan was carried out, wrapped and shivering, one ranger whispered again. They were protecting him. Whether true or a projection, the thought lingered. And once it reached the public, it would ignite imaginations far beyond the frozen slopes of Wyoming. By the time Ethan opened his eyes again, the circle was gone. But a different kind of witness remained: a trail camera that had captured part of the night. And when the footage was reviewed, what it revealed would turn a quiet rescue into a story that swept across communities from small Wyoming towns to national newsrooms. Back at the ranger station, the air was heavy with disbelief. Ethan lay in a medical cot, pale but alive, tended by paramedics. His rescuers sat nearby, still replaying the scene in their minds. They had witnessed something that refused to fit into the columns of their field manuals. A grizzly bear had chosen not to attack. Several had chosen to stand guard. No one wanted to speak first, but all of them knew without proof the story would sound like an exaggeration. Then someone remembered the trail cameras. Along Ridge 9, several motion-activated units had been installed to monitor wildlife activity, part of a long-term study of grizzly bear movements. Rangers checked these every week, swapping cards, logging data. On the night Ethan fell, 2 of those cameras were aimed at the clearing where he lay unconscious. By afternoon, the memory cards were pulled, slotted into a laptop, and projected on a screen. The room went silent. The first clip showed only shadows, branches bending in the wind, snow drifting. Then, at 3:11 a.m., a large form entered the frame. A grizzly bear. She stepped cautiously from the tree line, nose lifted to the air. Behind her, 2 smaller figures followed cubs, yearlings. They lingered restless while she lowered herself to the ground. The next frame captured something no one in the room expected. She lay down beside Ethan. Not on him, not touching, but close enough that their breath mingled in the frigid air. Minutes later, another bear appeared, younger, circling the edge. He sniffed the snow, pawed lightly at the ground, then paused near Ethan's boots. There was no lunge, no growl, only a moment of stillness, as if he too was deciding whether to stay. The footage continued, grainy but clear. At intervals, the cubs moved closer, then retreated. The older female shifted positions, sometimes sitting upright, sometimes lowering her head again. At one point, her gaze caught the camera, directly, eyes steady, expression unreadable. The room full of rangers shivered, though the building's heater hummed at full blast. By dawn, the bears began to disperse. The female rose, shook snow from her fur, and stepped back into the trees. The younger bears followed reluctantly. Ethan remained alone until the search team arrived. The final clip showed flashlight beams cutting through the clearing, rescuers rushing forward. Then the file ended. The room erupted in whispers. Some swore it proved grizzlies could display protective instinct. Others argued it was a coincidence. Perhaps the bears had simply been curious or conserving energy. But even the skeptics admitted the footage didn't look like predation. It looked like a vigil. Science again offers partial answers. Wildlife biologists note that large predators sometimes exhibit protective circling behavior within their own species. Wolves will encircle injured pack members. Elephants have been documented guarding the fallen. Even dolphins will hold weak individuals near the surface. But with grizzly bears, the literature is thin. Few case studies exist, and most encounters with humans end in avoidance or conflict, not guardianship. Still, this video now existed, a rare window into behavior that seemed to cross boundaries. When the footage circulated among local authorities, reactions split. Some officials urged caution, fearing that if the public romanticized grizzlies, hikers might take risks. Others saw opportunity, an opening to show that wild animals were more than threats. Within 48 hours, the video leaked beyond ranger circles. A regional outdoor blog posted clips with the headline, "Grizzlies Guard Fallen Ranger in Wyoming Wilderness." From there, the wildfire began. National outlets picked it up. Words like miracle guardian bears and forest angels appeared in headlines. Morning shows debated it with panels of wildlife experts, some nodding in awe, others shaking their heads in doubt. For the small community near Bridger-Teton, the story was even more personal. Hunters in town scoffed, "Grizzlies don't babysit one," said. Ranchers worried if bears were painted as benevolent, restrictions on hunting permits might tighten. But families, retirees, and wildlife enthusiasts embraced the tale, retelling it like a modern folk story. Children in school drew pictures of bears holding hands with rangers, and through it all, Ethan remained quiet. Still recovering, he avoided interviews. When colleagues asked what he remembered, he shook his head. His memories were fractured, cold air, warmth beside him, the sound of breathing. Maybe dream, maybe real. The footage confirmed at least part of it, but what it meant, that was harder to grasp. Here lies the lesson: proof does not always bring clarity. The video settled arguments about what physically happened, but not about why. Science seeks cause and effect. Humans seek meaning. In the space between, mystery lingers. A fresh perspective is worth noting here. We often look at wildlife stories through the lens of danger or salvation, either animals as threats to control or as miracles that save us. But what if the truth is simply coexistence? Wild animals do not owe us protection. They also do not exist only as predators. They exist as themselves, complex and contextual. The footage didn't show saints in fur. It showed decisions grizzlies choosing presence over aggression. That in itself is extraordinary. For rangers, the tape became both a comfort and a warning. Comfort because it suggested that Ethan's survival was aided, not hindered, by the very creatures he had spent his life protecting. Warning because it reminded them that no amount of training could prepare for every outcome. The wilderness writes its own script. Humans are only characters in it. And so the story grew beyond the clearing, beyond Ridge 9, beyond the small team of rescuers. It became a narrative wrestled over by scientists, locals, and strangers across the country. Each viewer projected something different onto the grainy images: empathy, mystery, caution, or hope. The footage didn't just shake the rangers. It shook assumptions about the boundaries between human and wild. As the public debated the footage, Ethan himself faced a different battle. His body was healing, but his mind carried fragments that refused to settle. What he remembered from that night wasn't only silence, it was the sensation of being watched, protected, and perhaps chosen, and those memories would soon draw him back into the very wilderness that nearly claimed him. Ethan Miller woke to light too sharp for comfort. A fluorescent hum filled the ranger station's infirmary, a sound far less forgiving than wind through pines. His arm was strapped in a sling, his head bandaged, his body stiff with bruises. Around him, voices murmured, boots clicked across the floor, and doors opened and closed. He was alive. That much he understood. But alive was not the same as whole. When his colleagues leaned in, smiling with relief, he tried to smile back. Yet something inside him held still. He remembered the fall, the sudden slip, the tumbling, the crash into frozen earth. After that, memory blurred. Cold, then blackness. But in the fog, something else pressed close warmth at his side. Heavy breathing above him, the faint vibration of a low rumble that didn't feel like a machine. He told himself it was a dream. Still, the sensation lingered like truth. Donna, a fellow ranger, sat by his bed and chose not to soften the story. "You were surrounded," she said quietly. "They didn't leave you until we arrived." She didn't need to say the word. "Grizzly bears." He blinked, waiting for her to smirk to explain. None came. Instead, she slid a memory card onto the table. Trail cams caught part of it. Later, when Ethan watched the footage, he felt the air leave his lungs. The images were grainy, but the shapes were unmistakable: bears circling standing guard, a female lying down near him. It should have terrified him. Instead, it unsettled him in another way. He had dedicated years to protecting wildlife, enforcing safety measures, and reminding hikers to respect distance. Now the roles had reversed. The wild had guarded him. His recovery was slow. Muscles ached, headaches throbbed, sleep fractured into restless fragments. Night after night, he woke drenched in sweat, heart racing from flashes of memory. Not of the fall, but of being watched in the darkness. The feeling was neither predator nor prey. It was something else, like recognition, and that troubled him more than pain. Psychologists who study wilderness trauma call this a double edge. Survivors don't just process the injury, they wrestle with meaning. Ethan was not only healing from broken ribs and a torn shoulder. He was trying to reconcile an experience that didn't match the rules he'd lived by. He had always told visitors, bears don't protect humans. They avoid us or confront us. Nothing in between. Yet his own body was proof of something different. Examples exist of similar struggles. In Alaska, a fisherman once survived when a polar bear chose not to attack. In Montana, a hunter collapsed and later reported a black bear had hovered nearby without striking. Each survivor returned home with the same burden. People doubted their stories. The footage from Ridge 9 made Ethan's case harder to dismiss. But evidence did not make understanding easier. Here is the small lesson: sometimes survival brings its own weight. People assume living through danger is a gift wrapped in gratitude. Often it is tangled in questions without answers. Why me? What happened? What do I do with this knowledge? Ethan asked all of these, silently turning them over as days bled into weeks. His supervisors encouraged him to rest, to take leave to avoid the wilderness until cleared by doctors. He nodded, but deep inside he knew rest wouldn't heal what pressed on his chest. He didn't want distance. He wanted clarity. Something in that clearing had unsettled the foundation of his life's work. He needed to stand in it again, awake this time, and see if the air still carried the same weight. Friends noticed the change. He spoke less, walked slower, and kept his thoughts to himself. At night, he wrote in a notebook, words spare and halting breath near me. For warmth, not fear, choice. He didn't show the notes to anyone. They felt less like records and more like confessions. A fresh perspective was forming in him. He had always believed his role was to manage wildlife for human safety. Now he wondered if the relationship ran deeper. Maybe coexistence wasn't just about keeping distance. Maybe it included moments of connection that couldn't be measured in data or protocols. He didn't call it compassion. He knew the danger of romanticizing wild animals. But he also couldn't call it a coincidence. This shift carried risk. Some of his peers warned him, "Don't go down the road of mysticism. We need facts." They were right. But facts alone no longer satisfied him. He had felt something real in that hollow. Denying it would not make it vanish. So he began to plan quietly. The sling would come off soon. His ribs were healing. He would return not as an officer with a clipboard, but as a man seeking unfinished truth. He didn't know what he'd find. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. The wilderness, after all, has a way of reflecting us at ourselves. For Ethan, recovery wasn't just about mending his body. It was about mending his understanding of what it means to share land with wild animals. He had lived his life thinking protection was a one-way act, ranger shielding wildlife, ranger shielding visitors. Now he wondered if protection could be reciprocal, in forms science hadn't yet named. The lesson here for us listening to his story is to hold space for mystery. Not every event in nature is meant to be catalogued or explained away. Sometimes survival is not a conclusion, but an invitation to reconsider, to humble ourselves, to accept that wild animals may carry instincts we cannot yet decode. Weeks later, as spring crept into the valleys, Ethan signed himself out of a leave earlier than advised. He didn't announce it. He simply loaded a pack, checked out a vehicle, and drove back toward Ridge 9. His heart pounded as he stepped onto the trail again, still scarred, still stiff, but drawn by something beyond reason. What he found on that return journey wasn't closure. It was a new beginning. For just beyond the broken slope where he had fallen, the forest carried a sign etched not by humans, but by claws, and waiting for him in the trees was a presence he thought he'd never see again. When Ethan Miller laced his boots that morning, the choice felt both reckless and inevitable. His body had mostly healed his arm. Stronger ribs no longer sharp with pain, but it wasn't his body that had brought him back. It was the silence inside his mind that no doctor could mend. Weeks had passed since the accident. His colleagues had moved on talking about new patrols and upcoming wildlife surveys. The video of the grizzly bears had circulated widely, dissected and debated. But for Ethan, none of that mattered. What mattered was the unanswered pull. He had to return. He signed out a cruiser before sunrise, the logbook catching only his name and a simple note, Trail 9 check. He didn't tell anyone his real intention. The road twisted through pine and aspen shadows stretching long. Snow was melting now, spring water carving small rivulets through the earth. But in the higher ridges, frost still clung, a reminder of how quickly the land could betray footing. The trailhead was empty when he arrived. He strapped on his pack, adjusted the sling strap still clipped across his chest, and began to walk. His pace was slower than before. Every step was deliberate, measured. The forest seemed different now. Not dangerous, not safe, just awake. Birds called overhead, branches creaked, and the wind shifted between cold and warm. It was as if the land remembered. When he reached the bend where his boot had first slipped, he paused. A new wooden sign had been installed, "Caution unstable section. Closed to patrol." He touched it lightly, then stepped past. Some risks can't be avoided when the question you carry is heavier than the danger underfoot. The slope looked the same, patches of ice still clinging to shaded rock soil, scarred by his fall. But when he climbed down to the hollow where he had lain, something caught his eye. On the bark of a young aspen tree, 3 long claw marks were etched deep. They weren't frantic scratches like those left in anger. They were measured, deliberate, facing inward toward the clearing. He placed his hand against them. The size matched the older grizzly bear from the footage. Not fresh, but not old either. He stood still, heart thumping. Was this a warning? A boundary or a marker of something he wasn't meant to interpret? Rangers are taught to read signs, track scat claw marks. But this didn't fit the manual. It felt closer to a message. Then the movement caught his attention. At the ridge above, about 50 yards away, a shape stood watching. A young grizzly, lighter in coat than the mother, eyes wide, unmoving. Recognition hit him like the cold. This was one of the cubs from the circle, older now, but unmistakable. They locked eyes. The bear did not retreat. It did not charge. It simply stayed. Ethan's instinct screamed caution. Training says don't approach, don't feed, don't make sudden moves. Yet he also felt something else, a connection too strong to ignore. Slowly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a granola bar. Not to lure, not to tame, but as a gesture. He knelt, placed it on a flat rock, and stepped back. The bear tilted its head. Its breath puffed in the cool air. It didn't move closer, not yet. But its posture was calm, alert, not hostile. Ethan felt the same steady weight he had felt that night, the sense of being acknowledged rather than threatened. He turned quietly and left the clearing, walking slowly until the trees swallowed him again. His heart pounded not from fear, but from something harder to name. Here lies the explanation. Bears, especially young ones, learn from experience. If this cub had been present that night, it may have remembered his stillness, his scent, his helplessness. Wild animals do not forgive or forget easily, but they do learn. Recognition between species is rare, but not impossible. Studies show elephants can remember human individuals years after encounters. Wolves adjust their behavior based on specific shepherds or rangers they meet repeatedly. Why not a grizzly cub? Examples exist, though they remain controversial. In Canada, a black bear once returned to a campsite where a camper had collapsed, lingering days later without aggression. In Russia, a brown bear was documented sniffing the same spot where a hunter had once been injured months after the event. Scientists debate. These stories, are they memory or coincidence? But for the people who lived them, coincidence feels too thin a word. Ethan left the clearing that day with more questions than answers. But he also carried a small lesson. Not all returns are about closure. Sometimes they are about conversation. Not spoken in words, but in actions exchanged across species. A claw mark, a quiet gaze, a granola bar left on a stone. This perspective matters. Too often, human encounters with wild animals are reduced to danger reports or tourist stories. But coexistence is layered. It includes fear, respect, memory, and sometimes a brush with recognition. To view wildlife only as threats is to miss their complexity. To see them only as saviors is to endanger ourselves. The truth lies somewhere harder, acknowledging both their capacity for danger and their capacity for decision. As Ethan walked back to his truck, the forest felt changed again. Not because it had bent to him, but because it had met him halfway. He didn't tell anyone what he saw. Some stories can't survive the weight of skepticism. They are meant to be carried, not argued. What Ethan couldn't know was that his private ritual of returning would not stay private for long. Word travels quickly in small towns, and soon a young scientist named Nolan Carter would arrive, carrying theories about empathy in wild animals and a determination to capture on paper what Ethan preferred to leave in silence. News never stays contained in small towns. By early summer, whispers of Ethan Miller's quiet returns to Ridge 9 reached people beyond ranger circles. Some dismissed them as a rumor. Others leaned closer, eager for details. Among them was a young wildlife biologist from Jackson, Dr. Nolan Carter. Ambitious and field-driven Nolan had built his reputation on bold theories about cognition in apex predators. When he heard about the ranger who survived a circle of grizzly bears and then returned to find one of those cubs again, he knew he couldn't ignore it. He appeared one morning at Ethan's cabin, unannounced, a notebook in hand, a camera slung across his shoulder. "I'm not here to sensationalize," he said. "I just want to see it, to understand." Ethan hesitated. He had spent weeks guarding the experience like something fragile. He feared that turning it into data would strip away its weight. But Nolan's persistence was steady. Eventually, Ethan agreed to let him join on the condition that nothing be published without his consent. Together, they hiked into the wilderness. Ethan moved slowly, cautious, every step a decision. Nolan walked briskly at first, brimming with curiosity, but soon matched Ethan's pace as the forest thickened. When they reached the clearing, Ethan pointed quietly to the aspen marked with claws. Nolan crouched, tracing the grooves with his fingers. "Deliberate," he murmured. "Not random scratching. This looks like sign-making." He scribbled notes, eyes alight. Ethan watched with unease. For him, the claw marks were more than data. They were part of a wordless conversation. But Nolan pressed further, asking about scents, whether exact positions of the bears. Ethan answered reluctantly, knowing that science demanded detail. Yet every answer felt incomplete. Here lies the tension. Science thrives on evidence patterns and replicable data. The wilderness does not always cooperate. What Ethan experienced was singular, unrepeatable, layered with mystery. To Nolan, it was a puzzle worth solving. To Ethan, it was something closer to sacred. Still, Ethan listened as Nolan explained theories. Studies of elephants had shown them standing guard over fallen companions, even extending that behavior toward humans. Wolves, too, sometimes encircled injured pack members. Dolphins had been documented supporting weaker individuals at the surface. If such empathy could exist in social predators, why not in grizzly bears? The footage of Ethan's rescue, coupled with his later encounter, could suggest a form of emergent cognition and awareness beyond instinct. Examples bolstered Nolan's view. In Alaska, there were scattered reports of brown bears lingering near collapsed hikers, not attacking, but not leaving. In Siberia, hunters told stories of bears pacing near fallen comrades, almost like reluctant witnesses. Most scientists dismissed these as anecdotes, unreliable. Yet strung together, they hinted at something more. Nolan believed Ethan's story could provide the missing thread. But Ethan resisted. "You're trying to fit this into charts," he said one evening by the campfire. "But maybe it isn't supposed to fit. Maybe some things aren't meant for proof," Nolan countered gently. "Without proof, the public forgets. With proof, they might protect." His words carried weight. Conservation battles often depend on stories that capture hearts, but also on data that convinces lawmakers. This clash revealed a small lesson: experiences in the wilderness hold dual value. They are deeply personal, shaping identity and belief. Yet they can also serve larger purposes, fueling science policy and protection. The challenge lies in balancing reverence with evidence. For the community, the debate mirrored a larger divide. Hunters near Bridger-Teton scoffed at the idea of guardian bears. "You're humanizing them," they said. Ranchers worried it would strengthen arguments against issuing hunting tags. Conservationists, however, embraced the story as a rare bridge proof that grizzlies were not just predators, but complex beings deserving space. Parents told their children bedtime versions emphasizing the bear's restraint. Hikers began asking rangers if the guardian bears might appear on their trips. Ethan bristled at this. The last thing he wanted was tourists seeking miracles in places meant for caution. A fresh perspective began to form in Ethan himself. Watching Nolan wrestle with theories, he realized that science and spirit didn't have to cancel each other out. The footage, the claw marks, the cub's gaze, all could be studied, but they could also be honored as mystery. The real danger wasn't choosing one lens over the other. It was pretending only one lens mattered. In his journal, Ethan wrote, "Science asks how, mystery asks why. Maybe both are needed to tell the whole story." Still, tension remained. Nolan pushed for documentation. Ethan asked for silence. Their partnership grew uneasy, balanced on respect but strained by different goals. Yet one evening, as they returned from the clearing, the decision was made for them. From the ridge above, movement stirred. The same young bear stepped into view. Behind her, the older female appeared, scarred muzzle, steady eyes sharp. Nolan's breath caught. His hand lifted his camera by reflex. Ethan's voice cut low. "Don't." The bears did not rush. They simply stood watching. The cub tilted her head and the mother shifted slightly forward. Ethan stepped out from the trees slowly, hands open. He touched the pouch he had left on the stone days before, a quiet gesture of return. Then he backed away. The bears lingered another moment before fading back into shadow. Nolan lowered his camera. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with realization. "That wasn't an accident," he whispered. "That was choice. Here lies another lesson. Sometimes the wild does not give us what we want, but what we need." Nolan wanted data. Ethan wanted silence. The bears gave them both a moment of decision, then withdrew, as if reminding them that interpretation belonged to humans, not to them. Later that night, Nolan confessed he had taken no photos. "I thought I had to prove it," he said, "but maybe proving it would ruin it." Ethan nodded, relieved. Some truths endure better as stories than as statistics. For us listening now, the takeaway is clear. Conservation isn't just about science or stories, it's about both. Numbers convince policymakers. Stories move hearts. And when they converge, change is possible. The mystery of Ethan's circle of grizzlies sits precisely at that intersection. It is both evidence and parable, both wild animal behavior and human reflection. But the forest was not done with Ethan yet. The next test would come not in silence, but in a storm. And this time it would be the young bear, not the ranger who lay at the edge of survival, swept into a flood that would demand a choice as dangerous as any Ethan had ever faced. Storms in the Wyoming wilderness do not arrive politely. They sweep in low, carried by mountain winds, turning quiet stream into violent rivers within hours. Ethan Miller had seen it before. But that spring the snowmelt was heavier than usual. Rains hammered the valleys, and creeks that once trickled softly roared with foam and debris. Trail 9. Already unstable, became dangerous. Rangers warned hikers to stay clear. Ethan, though no longer on duty, couldn't ignore what he knew was happening. He strapped on his boots and set out. By the time he reached the ridge above Miners Hollow, the storm was already in full voice. Rain stung his face, thunder rolled through his chest. Below, the creek had swollen into a torrent, logs and rocks tumbling in the current. At first he thought he was mistaken, a flash of brown, a blur against white water. Then he saw it clearly. A grizzly bear cub, no longer tiny but still young, spun helplessly in the current. Paws flailed, head dipped under, then surfaced again, eyes wide with terror. Ethan didn't think. Years of ranger training took over. He anchored a rope around a pine, looped it across his chest, and slid down the bank mud clinging to his boots. The river nearly took him as soon as he entered cold, slamming his body current, dragging him sideways. He fought forward, arms burning, lungs gasping. The cub clung weakly to a fallen log, wedged against rocks, too exhausted to climb free. When Ethan reached her, he expected resistance claws striking in panic. Instead, she stilled, eyes locking with his, as if recognizing something. He hooked his arm under her shoulder, shouted against the roar, and pulled. The current fought back, dragging them under twice before the rope tightened and he gained ground. Inch by inch, he hauled them toward shore. His muscles screamed water, choking his breath. But finally, his boots hit rock, then soil, and they collapsed together on the bank, coughing, shivering, alive. For a long moment, neither moved. The cub's chest rose and fell rapidly, her fur plastered with rain and river foam. Then she leaned into him, not with force, but with weight, as though her bones had decided to trust his for one fragile moment. Ethan pressed a hand lightly against her side, feeling the wild heartbeat steady under his palm. Then he saw her. At the ridge above the older female stood scarred muzzle catching rain, eyes locked on them. She did not growl. She did not approach. She only watched breath visible in storm air. Ethan stood slowly guiding the cub upward, step by step. The mother never moved, only remained until they reached level ground. By the time Ethan looked again, she was gone, but her tracks remained deep and clear facing them. Here lies the explanation. Bears, like many wild animals, are strong swimmers, yet floods can overwhelm even the most capable. Cubs, especially yearlings, are vulnerable in swollen rivers. Ethan's intervention crossed a dangerous line. Rangers are taught never to interfere directly, both for human safety and to prevent habituating wild animals. But in that moment, instinct overrode policy. This was not about management. It was about survival. Examples exist of similar rescues. In Alaska, locals once saved a moose calf from drowning, though wildlife officers later warned against such actions. In Montana, a black bear cub was pulled from a culvert by rangers after a flash flood. Each time, the tension is the same: protect the animal, but risk teaching it that humans are helpers. Ethan knew this risk, yet the choice had already been made when he tied the rope. The small lesson here is simple. Sometimes compassion defies rules. Not every act of rescue fits the handbook. And while science cautions against anthropomorphism, humans are not separate from the natural world. When faced with a drowning cub, Ethan's instinct was not calculation, it was action. That instinct speaks to something larger than training. A fresh perspective emerges. Conservation often emphasizes distance, and rightly so. Respecting wildlife means not interfering, not feeding, not intruding. But coexistence is also built on rare moments of shared vulnerability. The cub's eyes in that river were not the eyes of a predator or a symbol. They were simply the eyes of another living being, terrified, reaching the edge. Ethan's choice didn't erase danger, but it illuminated connection. That night he stayed at the ranger outpost instead of returning home. He built a fire, soaked clothes, and left the cabin door cracked. The cub lay just outside under the awning, not entering, but not fleeing either. She rested within reach of warmth, breathing slowly, watching him. At dawn, when the rain ceased and the mountains glistened under new light, she rose, looked once at him, and walked back toward the trees, stronger, freer. For Ethan, the moment was more than rescue. It was confirmation. The circle of grizzlies months before might have been chance instinct or something deeper. But now, with his own life risked and the cub's life saved, the connection had become undeniable. He no longer doubted whether the wild had chosen to acknowledge him. The question now was what he would do with that recognition. By summer's end, Ethan had decided. He could not keep living as if nothing had changed. His service as a ranger had ended, but his bond with the wilderness had only deepened. And when he returned one final time to the clearing on Ridge 9, what he found waiting was not danger, but a farewell marked in stall pine and silence, an answer only the wild could give. The decision came quietly. Ethan Miller handed in his resignation at the ranger station one morning without ceremony. No speeches, no goodbyes, just a signed paper and his badge left on the desk. Years of service, countless miles walked, rescues made, warnings given. But after what had unfolded on Trail 9, his work had shifted from enforcing rules to carrying a story that no policy manual could contain. He packed a small bag with essentials. His journal, a compass, a faded leather pouch he'd once carried on long patrols. Then he drove toward the mountains, one final time. The Bridger-Teton range rose ahead, peaks washed in late summer light. For most people, it was just wilderness, untamed land, home to wild animals, forests, rivers, and storms. For Ethan, it had become something else, a place that had held him when he was broken, surrounded him when he was vulnerable, and accepted him in ways no human community ever had. The trail was familiar, yet each step felt different now. His pace was steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of choice rather than duty. He stopped at the ridge where the sign still warned of unstable ground. He touched the wood, then stepped past. The hollow was unchanged trees, rocks the slope where he had fallen, but something new awaited. On the flat stone where he had once left a granola bar months earlier, a circle of river stones had been placed, 12 of them side by side forming a ring. In the center, a pine cone split open seeds scattered neatly. Beside it lay his ranger badge. Not dropped, not lost, but set there deliberately. Ethan froze. His heart pounded as though he'd stumbled into a sacred space. He hadn't brought the badge. Yet here it was. He stepped closer, then stopped himself. The forest was silent, as if holding its breath. From the tree line, a shadow moved. Slowly, the older grizzly bear emerged. Her muzzle carried more gray now, her gait slower but steady. She did not charge. She did not retreat. She simply stood, eyes fixed on him. Ethan knelt. He didn't speak loudly, but words slipped out anyway. "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he was thanking her for that night for her cub, or for the strange bond that had rewritten his life. Perhaps all of it. The bear blinked once, then turned back into the trees, vanishing as quietly as she had appeared. For Ethan, the message was clear. His time as a ranger had ended, but his time as a witness had just begun. His journal now carried not just notes of patrols and sightings, but reflections about coexistence, compassion, and mystery. He wrote, "The wild knew me better than most people ever did. I was never alone. I was chosen. Here lies the explanation." Conservation is not only about laws and science. It is about relationships between people and land, between humans and animals, between stories and truth. Ethan's experience revealed that wild animals, even grizzly bears, are not only symbols of fear or danger. They are complex beings whose decisions sometimes defy expectation. Recognizing that doesn't mean romanticizing them. It means respecting them more deeply. Examples of such recognition stretch across cultures. Indigenous communities in North America have long spoken of bears as teachers and guardians, not just predators. Modern science now begins to echo some of these perspectives. Studies of predator cognition, memory, and empathy suggest that our old categories of threat and instinct may be too narrow. Ethan's story doesn't prove these ideas, but it invites us to look again. The lesson is simple but profound. We share the wilderness, not control it. When a ranger falls and grizzly bears choose not to harm, when a man risks his life to save a cub in floodwater, when stones and seeds appear arranged on a rock. Each of these moments blurs the boundary we draw between us and them. Maybe the boundary was never as sharp as we believed. Knowledge gained here is both scientific and personal. We learn that grizzly bear behavior is more variable than textbooks suggest, that in cold seasons, energy conservation can override aggression, that recognition across species is possible, and that young bears remember. But we also learn something about ourselves, that survival can carry questions heavier than wounds, that humility before nature is not weakness but wisdom, that protection flows both ways in unexpected forms. For us as listeners, emotions stir because this is more than an animal story. It is a story about trust, about what it means to be held in the gaze of something untamed and still feel safe. It reminds us that life is not just about control, but about surrender, about recognizing that sometimes the wilderness chooses mercy and sometimes we are called to mirror it. A fresh perspective emerges here. We often approach conservation with numbers. Population counts territory, maps mortality rates. These matter. But stories like Ethan's remind us why those numbers matter. Without the human heart moved by awe, no policy lasts. Without science, grounded in fact, no story sustains. It takes both to protect wildlife and wilderness. Ethan's farewell in the Tetons is not an end. It is a reminder of the balance we are all invited to carry. So we close with a question for you watching and listening. Where in your own life have you felt surrounded by people, by animals, by silence itself? What moments have reminded you that you are not alone? Even when the world told you otherwise, reflect on those moments. Let them shape how you see your place in this larger living world. If this story of a ranger of grizzly bears and of an unexpected circle in the wilderness has touched you, share it. carry it. And if you believe, as Ethan now does, that compassion can live in the most unlikely places, then stay with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us each week as we bring you more animal stories, real stories of wild animals, wildlife rescue, and the bonds that keep reminding us of who we are.